Brilliant. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Introduction to Museums Advocacy, which is the beginning of Advocacy Camp for this year. So we're very excited to have you all here, and it is a pleasure to see so many people turning up on a Wednesday morning to talk about advocacy. So I will go ahead and ask Heather to start the poll while people are just filtering in from the waiting room. I think we have a few more people coming in. And yes.
Meg, this is Advocacy Camp. Do we have s'mores? Do we have s'mores being served in a few minutes?
Well, you know, when we get to do this in person, Dan, I will make sure there are s'mores.
Okay. And I want to be the canoe instructor.
Okay, well, we'll keep that in mind.
All right, I'll quit clowning. Go ahead.
So if people don't mind going ahead and filling out the poll, and Heather, if you can, give us the breakdown in a minute or two when people have a chance. I'm assuming people are here because either you are signed up for Museums Advocacy Day in a couple of weeks, or you're thinking about joining us for New England Museum Week in mid-March, both of which that's really awesome. If you're just generally interested in advocacy and you maybe didn't register for Museums Advocacy Day in time, or you just sort of have been meaning to find out more about it and you know this is an election year, that's fabulous too, because advocacy can be done at any time and you don't need to wait for somebody to organize it for you. So we'll go through some of the basics today, and we have more coming tomorrow with more in-depth information about how to use social media for advocacy and how to write and use impact statements if you are interested in really getting your teeth into the nitty-gritty of some of the best things to do with advocacy. So we'll do quick introductions here. My name is Meg Winnicates. I'm the Director of Engagement for NEMA, and advocacy is under my umbrella of job responsibilities here in NEMA. Speaking with me today is Dan Yeager. Dan, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey everybody, I'm Dan. I'm the Executive Director of NEMA. Thanks so much. I'll kick it over to Heather.
Hi, I'm Heather Riggs. I'm Director of Administration here at NEMA. Did you want me to share the poll results for you, Meg?
That would be perfect. Thank you, Heather.
Do you want to introduce Scarlett and then I'll come back to it?
Sure thing.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Scarlett Hoey, Director of Membership and Development here at the NEMA office, which is the homelands of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts people, past and present. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, so the poll results are 67% said they are totally new to this. 25% have done some interacting with public officials or campaigns. 8% are relatively comfortable but looking to refresh my skills, and 0 are not comfortable or very comfortable. So,
all right, well then we did a good job marketing this as Introductions to Museum Advocacy then. Excellent. So we are very happy, as I said, to have everyone here. We'll get started with saying the fact that you have turned up at all is the best first step, and you are the most important voices to represent your museums because you are the ones who care enough to show up and be speaking up for museums. So that is fabulous. And as a reminder, this is a great starting point. And once you get going, advocacy is all about relationship building. So you rarely see immediate results, but if you keep showing up, then you can build some really fabulous relationships with your public officials, et cetera. Now, I would like to start by saying you probably know a lot more about advocacy than you think you do, because advocacy exists on the continuum of public communication that we as museum professionals are all already on. So when you think about, for instance, ways that you are putting out, say, on social media, what's going on with your organization, there's your basic public relations where you're letting people know we have a program coming up. This is when it's happening. So you let people know that you exist and what's going on with you, whether that's a press release or something on your website or a bulletin to the people who subscribe to your newsletter, et cetera. Then moving forward a little further on the continuum, you've got education, where you're teaching people specifically about a topic related to your mission. So incorporating really interesting facts about some object in your collection on your Instagram profile, etc. Advocacy is just the next step beyond that, where you take the concept of teaching people about an issue and talking about how that particular issue, cause, etc., intersects with your organization and how it impacts your organization. So it's basically just taking your mission and looking at what's happening in the world and saying, when these two intersect, this is what happens to our organization and what we need from people in order to be able to continue to do what we do well. Lobbying, which is the thing that everybody gets really nervous about, is the step beyond that. And there isn't actually anything to be nervous about, because none of you are professional lobbyists and none of you need to be. What takes something from advocacy into lobbying is making a specific ask. So saying something like, we want you to vote for this, or we want you to vote against this. And you can check your specific rules by state, but the general rule of thumb is if you are spending less than 10% of your time talking to public officials about how they should or should not vote, you cannot get in trouble as a nonprofit employee or as a nonprofit. So saying, we would like you to support this is not going to get you in any kind of trouble. And we'll go back through the specifics of that in a moment. But what we're talking about most today is advocacy, and thinking about advocacy essentially is education. You're telling people, here's what's happening and here's why it matters. And then you can leave it up to them what choice they make to do with that information. But advocacy is a major part of letting people know what's going on and why it's important. And you can never really get in trouble for doing that, because that's just education, and all nonprofits are allowed to do that. It's only when you get to a specific ask being made from a nonprofit social media profile or something where you might be on dodgy ground that people get nervous about. So, rules for nonprofits. You are allowed to inform, but not instruct. So you can do things like say, here's an issue that's important to our organization. The candidates in our local election have stated these particular things about how they feel about this issue. And then you stop and you don't tell them, therefore we support this candidate. So you can talk about issues, but not about people. You can talk about issues till the cows come home, and you can say, this is why this is important, and this is how this impacts our organization and the people that we serve. You just can't say, and therefore we think candidate X is trash, please don't vote for him or her. You can only do the first part. You can ask for support. You can say, we hope you will consider this issue when you go to the ballot box or when you are voting on the legislative floor, et cetera. But the other thing you have to make sure that you do is that you have to stay nonpartisan. So museums and other nonprofit organizations can, for instance, be host to a political event, but if somebody from the other party also wants to host an event, you also have to say yes. So you can't be preferencing one party over the other. A lot of places choose to just try not to get involved at all. But the thing is that museums and our cousins, aquariums, zoos, historical sites, et cetera, all have the potential to be really cool and valid places to be a place for a press conference or a rally or whatever. The only thing is you have to make sure that you say yes to people on both sides if both sides want to be able to do that. Rules for individuals. If you work for a nonprofit and you're concerned that your actions may reflect back on your nonprofit, the major things you have to make sure that you're doing is if you're speaking as an individual, then you contact your legislator as an individual from your own social media account or from your own email account instead of your work account, and make sure that you're doing that on your own time. Now that can include your lunch breaks or et cetera. If you're working flex time and it's technically 9 to 5 work hours, but your actual work hours are shifted and you are currently on personal time, then that's fine. And then when you're trying to find kind of the intersection here of, gee, I work at a relatively large organization, can I speak for my museum? That's a question that you need to figure out with your colleagues. So with smaller organizations, sometimes it's a little easier to figure out like, hey, we're sending this person and they're going to be talking about this because they're already the person who's kind of the public face who already talks to the press and et cetera. When you're dealing with a larger organization, then it's really important to just check in. Some really big organizations actually have like a government relations position. And so if you work at an organization like that, then you want to go ahead and check in with them before you're doing any advocating where you're talking about identifying yourself with your organization, just to make sure that you're not sending cross messages. But for the most part, usually what is the safest thing to say is, I'm here today if you're in an office visit, talking to you as an individual who works in this organization, and this is important to me and this is important to my organization because, and that will basically cover it. And before we get into talking about the why are we here and crafting your all important because statement, I am first going to turn it over to Dan, who's going to go through kind of the basics of your elevator speech and the art of the ask. So thinking about how do you craft either a conversation or a letter or a Twitter thread, et cetera, when you are thinking about interacting with public officials. So your turn, Dan.
Muted. You think I'd have the hang of this by now. Thank you, Meg. Before I share my screen, does anybody have any questions at this particular moment of time of anything that Meg has said so far? Any comments or clarifications? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and we're going to talk about elevator speeches. Can I do that? Here we go. Okay, so one of the most important aspects of being a good advocate is to be able to communicate your message very clearly and concisely. And that means it's absolutely essential for you to be able to have a well-crafted elevator speech at the ready, wherever you go. An elevator speech is generally defined as being you being able to tell your story in 1 minute or less. And that's roughly the amount of time, hypothetically, that it takes for you to give a good impression of yourself to somebody that's riding with you at on an elevator. They get on at the ground floor with you and riding to the top of the elevator, right? So your elevator speech is really your verbal calling card that you can kind of pull out of the recesses of your memory whenever the time warrants. And it's used both informally in things like networking events and those kinds of things, and more formally in situations like in advocacy, where you go and meet your elected officials, or pretty much meeting anybody that's very important to both your life and your career. So to craft the perfect elevator speech, what you do is basically hone your experience and accomplishments and aspirations into a concise mini presentation, as it were. And then you memorize it so that you can pull it out of the recesses of your memory whenever the situation warrants. Now, your goal here is to create an extremely positive first impression of confidence and poise that people are going to remember and remember your message and want to continue to have a relationship with you, as Meg just pointed out. So a good elevator speech makes others recognize you as a very confident leader, able to articulate your museum's mission, and respected for your knowledge and your ability to inspire and all those good things. One of the most important things, though, to remember about an elevator speech is that it's not a speech at all. It's an elevator conversation. Your goal isn't to really educate your listener, although that's part of it. Your goal is really to engage him or her, because the best way to do that, of course, is not to just continue to talk and talk and talk about one-sidedly your own perspectives and your needs and your wants. It's much more impressive to be able to engage the listener in a back and a forth, in a conversation, so to speak. That's going to be an awful lot more memorable over the course of time, and it's going to create, again, a much more positive impression, so that the conversation is very natural and relaxed and conversational. So as you can imagine, an elevator speech does require a good bit of ad-libbing, so to speak, because you never know when you're actually going to be using it, and you never know with whom you're going to be using that elevator speech. People pop in and out of your day, and there are occasions that you have to tailor the elevator speech to that particular that particular person or situation. The way to do that, though, is to really sort of take that elevator speech and boil it down into manageable chunks. You want to be able to memorize it, right, to some degree, be so familiar with this story inside of you that you're able to just come up with it and the phrases and the wording and so forth. But you're also able to tailor it to a particular situation, so that if you're talking to an elected official, you've got sort of one aspect of your elevator speech that you pull out. If you're talking to a funder, it's a different elevator speech, perhaps, or an employer or an employee prospect, you know, if you're job seeking and so forth. How much time do you have to deliver your elevator speech? Well, that requires a little bit of ad-libbing too, because, you know, if the rule of thumb is a minute that you have, you got to boil it down to a minute or less. That's actually sort of like somebody going all the way to the top of the building in the elevator with you. But what if they're getting off on the 10th floor or the 15th floor? You know, you only have a shorter amount of time, maybe even the 15, 20, 30 seconds. You know, so you need to be able to pare back two essentials, really, you know, thinking to yourself, what ultimately do I want this person to take away from what I'm saying? So you want to be very, very flexible when you're delivering your elevator speech. Okay, so here are some of my top tips for developing the content of your elevator speech. First, remember to keep it simple. Your elevator speech should seek to deliver a handful of memorable, sticky ideas, so to speak, that your listener is going to remember forever and ever and ever. And these sticky ideas are the framework around which you organize your conversation. Ideally, you won't have any more than, say, one or two key ideas. Any more than that, and your listener's eyes are going to glaze over. They're going to get bored. So you really do want to ask yourself, what do I want this listener to fully remember about me and take away? Second, try to tell what's unique about you and what you do. A lot of times people fall back on, you know, sort of like, oh, I work in a museum, or I'm a museum educator or something like that. Tell people really what it is that you do. You're an audience engagement specialist, say, at a museum that specializes in virtual reality. They're pioneering this in, you know, audience engagement for visitor experiences and that type of a thing. Communicate specifically why you and your institution are special in particular, to make that, you know, very memorable to folks. You have to make it exciting. Try to create a presentation, things that really quicken your pulse first and foremost. And if you're excited, then your listener will be too. Really think about what it is that you're passionate about in your mission, in your activities, the people you serve, and the like. Thinking of your audience, who are you talking to, right? Who specifically are you talking to? And this is, sometimes it requires a little bit of homework. So in a situation like advocacy, when you know you're going to be visiting, say, with an elected official, you want to be able to really understand what makes that person tick, what their interests are, and the like. And that really then creates this sort of harmonic resonance in your conversation. You're able to help dovetail what it is that you have to say with what it is that their interests are. And that really then creates a much greater impact on that person. So in this context, again, you need to make it conversational. Think about, you know, what it is that you might even bring to some questions about the other person, just to draw a conversation out of them, not just your elevator speech, you disclosing information about yourself, but, you know, asking them questions about what it is that makes them tick. Another tip is to tell your story as a story. Try to give it a beginning and a middle and an end, perhaps, in some ways. And, you know, think about, you know, using personal anecdotes that sometimes help out. I know, for example, one of the things that I used to talk about when I was a museum director was this sort of complete serendipity. One time I was stuck on Route 128 in Boston in an epic traffic jam at one point. And as I was sitting there, I started thinking about what all the businesses were along 128, and that became an exhibition for you know, all of the inventions along 128, for example. And you can talk about the process, you know, of that anecdote being like that, oh, this was really a special thing for my museum because it just sort of came to me in a dream, so to speak. So anecdotes are sometimes good. Try to use powerful and evocative language that has lots of impact. And this is really what makes the sticky ideas stick. So for example, you don't just, you know, you don't love art, which you do, but, you know, instead of saying, oh, gee, I really love art, you live for art. or your museum's programming doesn't just educate kids, it inspires them to aspire, those kinds of things. In this context, you can also use judiciously use facts and figures, because a lot of times, specific numbers and metrics really do help out with conveying your message. So, for example, you don't just serve a lot of school kids at your museum. You specifically had 500 field trips this past year. Well, no, we don't do that anymore, but you served 20,000 kids perhaps at virtual field trips, and 22% of those kids were special needs kids and those kinds of things. That really helps the impact of what it is that you're saying. So again, judicious use of facts and figures helps out. Make sure that your elevator speech evolves. And this is kind of a trick. Once you get into the habit of really, as you're talking to folks, understanding that you do have an elevator speech, that you've got these patterns and modules that you bring out to talk to folks, get some feedback. Just kind of watch people's reactions to things. If they're particularly interested in one aspect of what you're saying, you might kind of hone that a little bit more and think a little bit about it. If people tend to be drifting off when you're talking about one aspect of your experiences, you might try to either help that a little bit along, or just get rid of it and try to add something else. So try to get feedback and respond to feedback. And last but not least, make sure you have a clear call to action as part of your elevator speech. Give your listener an indication of what you'd like them to do. So, if your objective is ultimately to be hired at the listener's company, ask how to submit a resume. Or if your objective is to have the listener introduce you to somebody else that might be important to your career, make sure that you go ahead and ask that person to make that introduction. In the advocacy setting, make sure you're clear about what you want your elected official to do. To vote for a piece of legislation, for example. As Meg said, you can do that within a certain context, but you can ask for a vote, or you can ask for that person to come to your museum and cut a ribbon on a new exhibition, say, or to support a grant application, those kinds of things. It's amazing to me that I find that most people are really willing to help out, but so many people are shy about actually making an ask, actually asking for something. They pull their punch. So please do always remember to think about what it is you want that other person to be doing. So the ask itself should be made in 3 phases, I find. And phase 1 is nestling that ask into that friendly conversation that we've been talking about. It's a tad awkward to just sort of shake hands with somebody and immediately blurt out what it is that you're looking to do. It's a little awkward and so forth. And especially if it's a new relationship, you want to spend a little time with some small talk, getting to know that person a little bit more, creating a little bit of warmth and a little energy in the room before you actually make the ask itself. And this is where, the elevator speech really does pay off. You're able to have that conversation with that person. Just be aware, though, of the body language and the like, of whether that small talk is ready to be wrapped up. If the person's kind of drumming their fingers on the table or looking at their watch or something like that, it's time to move on to phase 2. And phase 2 is making your case. And this is where all the preparation comes in, perhaps. Hopefully you've done your homework, you've gotten an idea of what makes that other person tick, what their interests are, and you're able now to connect and create that harmonic resonance with that listener and in your ask itself. So you're going to set the stage for your actual ask here. You're making your case. So you might say something like, Senator Smith, I know from your voting record, you're a strong supporter of K-12 education. You might be interested to know that our museum has recently undertaken a partnership with a local school system to create, say, an art-based after-school program, and we're looking for community support for a grant to fund the program. So that's making the case. The senator has this love of K-12 education, and you're now fitting yourself into that interest. And then phase 3 is the big moment, the big ask, right? So, Senator, would you be willing to submit a letter of support that we can include with our grant materials, right? That's the ask. And once you've made the ask, you want to give it a little space, a little breathing room. Try to keep your mouth shut, tough as that may be, and just simply wait for an answer. So answers come in 3 flavors: yes, no, and maybe. The easy one is they say yes, right? Congratulations, you've won. Responding to a yes is easy. You say your thanks to the person, you make sure that everyone is clear on next steps, whatever that might be, and you break out the fireworks and so forth. But what if they say no? Well, first of all, don't panic. Keep yourself centered and don't take it personally. It's important to listen at this stage very, very carefully, because I find that when somebody tells you no, gives you a no to whatever it is you're asking for, they feel a little compelled to give a reason why they're saying no to this. And when you pay close attention to what they're saying, it reflects back to them that their opinions have weight and legitimacy. First of all, you're showing them respect, but you're also kind of clarifying whether the no is really a no, or whether it's based on a misunderstanding of the way you've communicated yourself. And if it is based on a misunderstanding, you can go ahead and clarify that right away and be able to just make sure that the person understands what it is that you're actually asking for, right? So you want to do some clarifying. If you find that the no is actually based though on a person's their position or their policy, for example, the senator not being able to say yes to you because they make it a policy of not offering any support for grants or something like that in their office, then that's going to be for sure a no. Or if it's permanently out of their capability to offer you a yes, then it's going to be a real no. Everything else, though, you might want to consider to be a maybe, right? So maybe is one of the answer possibilities, and maybes are really slippery and frustrating forth because they're not a clear yes and they're not a clear no. So your challenge with a maybe is to define it. Now, it could be a maybe that's based on the listener's circumstances, right? If something changes in their life, then the maybe might transform into a yes. So for example, using our example of asking your senator for grant support, you might find out that another organization in your community has already asked the same thing. So the senator can't in good conscience, support both grants at the same time, right? But perhaps that maybe is based on this current year, and the senator is willing to support your grant application in a future grant cycle, that kind of a thing. So that something might change in their life. It could be that the maybe is based on something that's in your circumstances that you can control, or the relative value of your ask, and then the ball is in your court. So it might turn into a yes. For example, if something changes in your life, such as the senator can't support you for XYZ grant this year, you might be thinking, though, that, well, maybe you could change your grant application to ABC grant, different organization or something like that, and the senator would, in fact, support it. So be thinking about how you can be creative with maybes and turn them from, what is a little bit undefined into something that eventually will be actually a yes. But the big message here is whether the answer is yes, no, or maybe, it's important for you to follow up politely and professionally, whatever you do. It may seem obvious, but first of all, make sure that you express gratitude. Whatever the answer is, yes, no, or maybe, you should be, offering your thanks to the listener, and your goal should be to create a strong relationship with the listener so that it paves the way for future asks. And thanks goes a long way to that end. After you've offered your thanks, wrap up the conversation by recapping next steps. If you've just gotten a no, and especially if that's a no that's provisional, it might turn into a maybe that might turn into a yes at some point. Ask them permission if you can keep in touch and contact them again when circumstances change. And whatever you do, follow up on your promises. If you tell your elected official that you'll send more information about your museum or stay in touch or whatever, make sure you do it. And I know this is sometimes hard to do when you head home or you turn off your computer after your Zoom meeting and so forth, and life intervenes. But if you want to develop a meaningful relationship with them, it's important to make sure you deliver on your commitments and make sure that you're trustworthy in that regard. So that's a quick overview of elevator speeches and the art of the ask, essential tool for you to be really good advocates. And at this point, I'll stop sharing again, ask if you guys have any questions of me on that, and otherwise I'll turn it back over to Meg for the rest of the conversation.
All right, we'll give folks a minute to think about whether they've got any questions. If so, feel free to either pop them in the chat or go ahead and raise your hand and let us know you've got a question. While you're thinking about that, I will go ahead and,
Yep, Melanie, I see.
Melanie looks like she's got a question.
Just wondered if there's anything you should avoid, like a pitfall or something you should not say in those conversations. I mean, of course, there's a lot of things you shouldn't say, but any like rookie mistakes that you can give us to
Well,
avoid?
you know, the thing that we're all, you know, it's expected that in a situation, especially when you're talking with an elected official, that you get nervous. And sometimes when you get nervous, you do things that are just like, why did I say that? Why on earth was I, you know? And I think that sometimes the best rule of thumb is, you know, you really do have to be mindful, especially when you're going into these meetings, and just, you know, try to be yourself and your best self, which means that you're, you know, you're mindful. You take drinks of water, you pace yourself, you think carefully about what it is you're about to say, and don't try to overestimate your, I don't know what, skill or your experience. Sometimes we all try to puff ourselves up a little more. We talk a little bit, you know, too much about our museum, and we realize, you know, in certain ways that we realize afterward, man, I maybe oversold that a little bit or something. You know, just try to relax and stay within your own guardrails, so to speak, of truth and honesty and just who you are. If you're nervous, they all get that. They, you know, they understand that, you know, it's a power situation, and naturally you're a, you know, you feel a little bit like a supplicant. But you know, if you just stay yourself, then you'll be fine.
I would say
Thanks.
I have two major recommendations of things not to do. One of them is to talk too fast, which is definitely a problem I have, where I get really excited about what I'm saying, and I have so much, and I know I have a limited amount of time in order to be able to tell people what it is they need to know in order to be able to make the right decision, and that don't do that. So that's kind of a seconding to Dan talking about practicing and pacing yourself. I would say the other major thing not to do is to go into an office blind. You want to do a little bit of research of who you're talking to before you go in there. So the quickest and easiest way to do that is to scan their social media and look them up on whatever like governmental page there is to find out what committees they're on, that kind of thing. Because if you're asking for them to be voting for something where they're not even on the appropriate committee to be able to support that kind of thing, it just makes you sound like you don't know what you're doing. And so if you look at their social media, see what they're talking about right now on Facebook, on Twitter, on whatever their kind of local office page is, and see like what's bills they've been sponsoring, et cetera, what kinds of articles they might be retweeting. That gives you an idea of what's important to them, and that can help you pick the right language in order to be able to frame this around something that they're going to be interested in. My favorite example is I was talking to a state level legislator at the Massachusetts State House who the only things that I could find out that he was interested in were Little League baseball and small businesses. And I, you know, arts and culture, not something he was super interested in. So it wasn't until I framed museums as being mostly small businesses that like he literally stopped looking out the window, sat up and paid attention to me. And so that's just the very barest amount of research can really save you from either saying something really awkward or missing an opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Oh my goodness, yes. And Joe in the chat says, don't argue and pound your hand on their desk. Yeah, don't do that. Politely persuasive is what we're aiming for. Mussolini with the shoe on the desk, not the way you want to go. All right, so we will have a chance to think about this and practice thinking about like, why are you here? Why is this important? So getting back to my lurid pink slide here, the all important because. And the people who do this best that I have ever seen in the advocacy sphere are the libraries. Librarians and people who support libraries are insanely good at advocating because they are so good at identifying their because statements. They are so good at saying, you should support libraries because, because doctors support early literacy, because libraries provide services for folks who don't have high-speed internet at home, because libraries are now a library of things as well as a library of books. And if you need a sewing machine or a hammer or a particular kind of saw, you can get that at your library, because libraries are always open to everyone, regardless of how much or how little you have in your wallet. Like, libraries are really, really good at their because statements. And I invite anybody who's looking for inspiration to check out the ALA website and look at their advocacy section, because they've got some incredible materials there. And I'm going to get much deeper into talking about this kind of thing in tomorrow's session on writing impact statements. But still, being able to have a 1 or 2 sentence because statement, this matters to me because, or you should support this because, is really key. Because if you do not believe really firmly and have a lot of energy and passion in what you're saying, like Dan was saying very early on in his discussion, people will tune out. If you don't have energy to share, then they won't reflect any energy back at you. You want to be inspiring. No pounding the table, but you want to be inspiring. So what I would like you to do now is take a few minutes to think about what matters to you. Something, go ahead and type in the chat, something that drives you. It can be a lifelong value or a personal experience, something that's really happening in the world right now that you care deeply about, some kind of professional connection in terms of, this is happening to the people I work with right now and I really care about fixing XYZ. So we'll just go ahead and take a minute or two for you to think about that and then type it in the chat. You don't have to put it as a because statement, because we're going to get to that in a minute, but just think about what's something you really care about right now. I am always really alert to issues around, say, climate change and gun control, because I have a preschool aged child. And so I know he is growing into a world that we need to protect and make still livable for him. And I want to make sure that he's safe at school. So things like that are issues that are really, really important to me. So if you could go ahead and put in the chat some of what drives you, that would be great, because it would be really interesting to see what drives people. And it can be museum related or not at this point. All right, so we're seeing, oh, Scarlett, thank you for dropping the ALA link in the chat. You're wonderful. All right, access to art, especially for kids, getting kids outside and giving them a chance to work with their hands, helping museum people be the best they can be, the importance of local history and civics education. Yes, Jenna, awesome. Maintaining a healthy democracy, fabulous. Getting people excited about getting out on the water, making history and art accessible. These are all really good things to be passionate about. And I invite people to go ahead and keep putting that in as we go here. Is there anyone who would rather say it aloud than put it in the chat? And I can't really see people very well while I'm presenting, so I'm just gonna skim through a whole lot of little black boxes and see if anybody's turned their camera on in order to be able to say hi.
Or raise your virtual hand, right?
Yes, that works too. Okay, so thinking about your because statement, a little further up in the chat, I dropped a link to our Work Your Words sheet, which we put together several years ago as kind of a very short 3-sentence frame for talking about when I was younger, this, or at some earlier point, that. And because of that, this happened, and this is why I care about this, and this is what I want you to do about it. That's like the very shortest version of Dan's Art of the Ask. This is why I care. This is why you should care. Please do X. And so I would like to go ahead and give everybody a couple of minutes to think about either using that format or just thinking about the because statement. I am here today to advocate for museums because, or you should support say more public funding for museums because, and take like 3 minutes to think about what it is in your life and what drives you that brings you here today to learn to be a better advocate. And then we will go ahead and have a little conversation about that. So I'm going to mute. I'm going to set myself a timer. All right, so that's 3 minutes. So I want to check in and see if anybody, oh, thank you, Laura. All right. Laura's right out of the gate with her because statement. All right, I am here advocating museums because I believe children learn best when they get out into the world and have authentic hands-on experiences. Fantastic. All right. That makes me want to know more about the Yellow Farmhouse Center. So good job, Laura. All right. Melanie, I'm here to advocate for museums because they are unique spaces that give us new perspectives. Viewing and experiencing art, history, and culture is a portal into another world. Without them, we are more limited to our current reality. Fantastic. All right. Anybody else who wants to share, feel free to put it in the chat or again, raise your hand and unmute yourself because we would love to hear you say it with all that excitement in your voice. I'm happy to sound excited for you, but I'd much rather hear it from you. All right. Rosalinda is here to be inspiring kids to get excited about art and history. Excellent. Whoops. Sorry, I have a very hyperactive mouse and it just skipped several slides. My apologies. All right, well, we've got about 15 minutes left. So I want to go ahead and go through my last couple of slides. Please feel free to keep typing your because statements into the chat to inspire the rest of us. And I want to make sure we have some time for questions at the end as well. So a couple of things to do once you have your because statement, you want to be able to pick the things that are going to support that because statement. It's a little bit like a very, very short version of that 5-paragraph persuasive essay that you had to learn to write in, say, 8th grade English. So you want to pick the numbers that mean the most, as Dan was saying, pick the ones that tell your story best about number of school kids that you're serving or number of communities that you reach or percent of your budget that you put towards education, etc. Make sure you're supporting and balancing your facts and feelings. You want to be evoking an emotion in your conversational partner, but you also want to make sure that you are giving them the facts that they need in order to be able to make a decision, especially if they're asking them to vote in support of something or sign on to an appropriations letter, that kind of thing, which is a major ask for Museums Advocacy Day for folks who are here for that. Keep your facts bite-sized and relatable. If you're doing anything that is an infographic or a leave behind sheet, that sort of thing, make sure that it's visually appealing. We'll go into that a whole bunch more with impact statements tomorrow. So I recommend you join me for that tomorrow morning. And everyday comparisons are also really useful. For several years, people were talking about how funding for the NEA, when spread out over the population of the United States, it was the cost of a postage stamp per person. It was like 40 cents a head. And I'm not sure whether the math still works out or not. So I wouldn't turn around and use that again in 2 weeks at Museums Advocacy Day, but that's the kind of thing that people can latch onto. Like, oh, I know how much a gallon of milk costs. I know how much a stamp costs. If you can work it out to something that is something people already have a sense of what that's worth, that can be really, really helpful. Loving to see people typing in the chat. Thank you so much. All right, and as a reminder, you are not doing this alone. You can connect with your allies. There are people on this call from all across the US. Thank you so much. I see you, Iowa and Alaska. It's very nice to see you for a New England webinar. That must be very early in the morning for you. So here in New England, there are a lot of possible allies as well as national ones. There is, of course, the American Alliance of Museums. There's American for the Arts. There are things that are specifically for nonprofits who are less specifically museums, but they have often really useful, say, economic data that they sometimes break that down so that they have, say, employment information on the arts and culture sector or the education sector, things that we can pull from and say museums are part of this, and this is why this is an important part of the economic picture in your state or your region or your country, et cetera. So also CLHO, I saw Amris on the line, hello. Connecticut League of History Organizations does great advocacy stuff. So there are a lot of options, and we have many of them linked for you in our advocacy resource library. Thank you, Scarlett, who has already dropped the link in the chat because she reads my mind on a regular basis. Throughout the year, NEMA is doing a lot of different advocacy resources. So this is advocacy season, I like to call it. Between January to about March is when most state legislatures and also the federal government tend to be planning out their budgets for the next fiscal year. So that's when the most is happening. But we track bills all year that affect our constituents. We are always cooperating and collaborating with other professional service and advocacy organizations like CLHO, like Mass Creative, et cetera, like Create the Vote. We're doing things like organizing and attending rallies and meetings, creating trainings and toolkits like today, sharing resources like the resource library that Scarlett's just dropped in the chat there. And we are also really keen on getting your input on what matters to you, what's happening in your state, what kinds of things we should be aware of. And we are actively looking to have some folks join me and some members of the NEMA board on our advocacy committee. So if that's something that you find you're interested in, please feel free to email me. So Scarlett, I'm sure we'll put my email in the chat next as well. And so if there's anything that you think we should know about, there's both a submission form on our website, and you can also email me directly or reach out to anybody on the NEMA board, and they will get that information to me as well. Just as a reminder, our next big advocacy activity after the Federal Advocacy Day on February 28th and March 1st is New England Museum Week, where we've got a day for each state where we are celebrating New England museums all week long. So we will be doing mostly a social media style advocacy campaign and under the hashtag New England Museum Week. And we invite you all to participate, share good stories, sign up for the morning webinar for your state where we will have experts from your state talking about what's happening legislatively or what statewide opportunities are out there for museums to be aware of and participate in. And we hope to see a whole bunch of you there and online. And beyond the big advocacy organized events, there is a lot going on. It's a midterm election year, so a lot of people kind of transition from talking about budgets in the spring to thinking about voter registration and voter education in the summer and early fall. That's definitely a thing you can do, and I would be happy to talk to you about it more if you're interested. There's also, as Dan was saying, the follow-up and the relationship building where you keep in touch after you send an email or have a virtual visit or an actual phone conversation or whatever with your elected officials' offices. Keep in touch with them. If your organization does holiday cards of any variety, New Year's or otherwise, make sure that your elected officials are on your mailing list. Ditto for your monthly or weekly newsletters. Follow them on social media and like and retweet things that you can support, not necessarily always from your organizational account, because again, need to be somewhat careful of what kinds of things that you're doing there, but as an individual, you can certainly do that. And if you're talking about, say, publicly thanking your official for coming to visit, post a picture, all of that kind of stuff, that is absolutely a thing you can do, and it's not going to get you in any kind of trouble with the IRS, if that's what you're concerned about. Also, super helpful to make copies or scans of some of the best thank you letters you get from kids, or cute pictures or comments in your comment book, etc., and be able to share them over social media or by email with your legislative offices. So a lot of those are things that you're probably doing already. That's why we call it everyday advocacy. You know, you may be doing some of this scanning, et cetera, in order to be able to include things in grant reports. Well, if you're doing that, you might as well use what you've got a second time and be able to share that with people, et cetera. And I will be going a lot more into ways to be using some of this for social media tomorrow at 11 with Julie Arison Bishop from Museum Tastic. So welcome you to join us for that as well. And that's it from me. I realized and apologize that I started talking fast again at the end there. We have a few minutes for folks' questions. Please feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask. And if there's anything in particular that you have concerns about that you feel like the museum field should be talking more about, now is a good time to be bringing that up too. Dan, any last thoughts about things that advocates new to the world of advocacy should not leave without knowing?
Well, yeah, I think that, yes, take it easy, relax. This is, not rocket science. It is really what you do every day in other situations relating to people, your coworkers, your constituents, your audience, on and on and on, and talking about your institution to, say, elected officials or, anybody of influence. It can be a little, nerve-wracking in some ways if you approach it as a power game, like they have some power over, you and able to leverage things. But ultimately, it's the relationships. They're people. They have desires to do certain things and, to accomplish big things in their lives. And, if you sort of take it easy and figure out what it is that you have in common with them, it becomes very natural. And over time, it's a muscle that you use and it develops. Advocacy is that, you got to use it and practice and, work it out in order to become much more, proficient at it through say an elevator speech or whatever, but also your attitude. It just becomes a little more natural over the course of time. So I really encourage you, if you are in fact new to the game, to get in there, get in the arena, start working. It helps to do this as a group. So doing it with your state group, say at AAM Museums Advocacy Day in a couple of weeks, great way to do it. And also, NEMA's advocacy efforts, you're kind of power in numbers, so you feel like, okay, I'm supported, and that's a great way to experiment with it. So I applaud you for getting out there and doing it.
Thanks, Dan. We do have a couple more questions that came in the chat. One of them is, what guidance do we have for reaching out to elected officials when you're not already in the room with them? It's nice working with AAM. They work with a scheduling team. They get all the office visits set up for us. But just in general, do you use the generic contact forms on their websites, et cetera? And I would say almost all of the state houses are now open to the public again, which is great. Massachusetts is the last one to reopen, and I believe they're reopening next week. So as of the 22nd, we can go back to saying hello to our legislators. So you can call the office to try to set up an appointment. You can email them. Sending in the generic contact form does work. Sometimes if you look for they'll have a list of staff with staff emails, and you can reach out to somebody who might say, have education or culture in their research portfolio. And that ties into one of the things I was going to say, which is a lot of time you're going to end up talking to staff instead of directly to the elected official. And that's great. I love talking to staff because in general, I am a gigantic geek and I get really excited about things. And 9 times out of 10, the people who are staff in elected officials' offices are also really huge geeks about the things they really care about. And so I find them very easy to talk to. I find it very reassuring to see how much all of the people in these offices, regardless of where we fall relative to each other on the political spectrum, everybody is there, especially on the staff level, that really, they want to do the best thing possible for the people they represent. And that's really, really heartening. And then we also have a question here about politically correct or historically correct. One question in the big ask. I think, Dan, that's a question for you, but Tony, we might need to ask you to clarify that a little bit. Do you mind unmuting and try letting us know exactly what you're asking there? Because I'd love to answer it for you.
I just sometimes when you're talking about history museums in particular, the question comes up, people motivated, not technically historically correct, but for political influence, let's say. And I was wondering if there were any pointers or advice you would give on dealing with questions, especially with people who have an agenda when you're doing the big ask.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this comes up quite a bit in Museums Advocacy Day, because we here in New England tend to have, fairly responsive members of Congress, meaning they are generally supportive of culture in general and generally supportive of the things that museums do. In other places around the country, it's not quite as easy. And I know from colleagues that, sometimes the questions are a lot more tricky. And, we are living in this moment, especially we who are in the history crowd, where it all of a sudden becomes, potentially somewhat politicized. I think the advice that I would have, again, is, be yourself, be true to yourself and to your institution. And, if your mission is in fact to tell the straight out truth based on what you know at this particular time, I think that's an important thing to to stick with. And you yourself, just like, okay, you're for example, if there's just an issue of just reinterpreting the site based on what we know now, that type of thing, I think it's important to be honest about it. However, that is also I think, Meg's or somebody's point about not banging on the desk or whatever, there comes a point where it's pointless to argue. And you don't, what is it? You never bring a knife to a gunfight or whatever. I mean, you'll never win an argument with somebody that, over some of these points of history that become politicized. So, you need to agree to disagree and try to find, a way to salvage the visits so that you can continue to keep lines open and, build that relationship, because over time, I think that's what ultimately matters. But sometimes, I do believe you have to stick with what it is that you fully, believe, and your institution, as it works out. Did I answer your question, Tony?
Yes, sir.
Vague, but a little vague. But
I'm also going to tell you that somebody sent me a message a while ago that says diplomatically correct, which was a good term I've never heard.
Well, it goes to the bigger issues of, museums are not neutral, or are they neutral, and our landscape is changing as institutions. And I think more of us are understanding that, we have a role to play in sort of making sure that the dialogue, especially as it comes to truth, is upheld. We are among the most trusted institutions in our societies, and we want to keep it that way, right? So what we actually say has a lot to do with, how we present the truth and in the context of history. I think that that's an important thing to stay true to.
All right.
Not always easy, though.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
We're past 10:30, so anybody who needs to go, thank you so much for joining us. I will hang out for another couple of minutes if anyone has lingering questions. Kate does say that, yes, that's fascinating. And did you know what we're actually discovering in the historical records is a great way to turn the conversation back to facts as opposed to furor. So thanks for that great suggestion, Kate. That was a great way to wrap things up. Thank you again. Hope to see a bunch of you here tomorrow and then in a couple of weeks over at Museums Advocacy Day. Any last questions from folks? We'll go ahead and turn the recording off at this point.
Thanks, y'all.